This was the last notable duel fought in New South Wales. One of the combatants was Stuart Donaldson, who survived to become Premier of the state. His opponent was the Surveyor General of New South Wales, Sir Thomas Mitchell. Donaldson had dared to criticise Mitchell, and the result was this duel in Centennial Park. Each man fired 3 times, and on the 3rd round, Mitchell scored a hit. Mitchell drilled a hole in Donaldson's top hat, and the seconds said that was close enough. They declared the duel over. And so honour was satisfied, but Mitchell was not satisfied. Nothing could satisfy Mitchell. He achieved a great deal in Australia, and he was fortunate enough to find Australia Felix, which we know now as Western Victoria. But he could never rest easy, and his prickly temperament made him the stormiest of Australian explorers. Major Mitchell was a veteran of the Spanish Peninsular War and a skilled surveyor and mapmaker. He was appointed Surveyor General of New South Wales to follow Oxley, and he considered this gave him the right to do any exploring that needed to be done in Australia.
I embarked for this country with the prospect of succeeding Mr. Oxley in exploring the interior and surveying the physical geography of this colony. But I have hitherto been disappointed in all the prospects that induced me to accept an appointment here. An officer on full pay of a regiment here, who has never traveled anywhere, is to be sent to explore the interior, it being arranged that I would never leave Sydney.
That officer who had never travelled anywhere was Captain Sturt, and he soon travelled far and wide. Mitchell never forgave Sturt for this impertinence, but he also trained his guns on a far more powerful figure, the Governor himself. Mitchell accused Governor Darling of favouring Sturt because he was a relative. This wasn't true, but truth is the first casualty in war, and the Major had declared war on the Governor.
The spell that beams in woman's eye when Cupid throws...
Mitchell was a man of extraordinary and diverse talents. He wrote this love song, To the Spell That Beams in Women's Eyes. And he was also a poet, a military strategist, and an amateur inventor who designed a ship's propeller based on the boomerang. His exploration journals were beautifully illustrated and full of wide-ranging information. And he also wrote books on winemaking, translations of Portuguese poetry, and studies of advanced surveying methods. As Surveyor General, he laid down the major western and southern highways from Sydney and drew up the first general map of New South Wales. Even if he'd done no exploring, Mitchell would have left his mark on Australia. He certainly left his mark on Governor Darling.
I looked upon him as a hard-working, rude, ill-tempered fellow who quarrelled with everyone, and who, I may say, is still as much detested as ever by those who have any business to transact with him. Anxious to get on with the business of government, I was willing to make every sacrifice, while he was allowed to snarl and growl unheeded, until at last his insolence became intolerable.
Governor Darling did his best to have Mitchell sacked. But instead, it was Darling who got the sack. Mitchell intrigued with powerful friends in the British government to help remove Darling. And within a month of Darling's departure, Mitchell got government approval for his first expedition. He took 17 men, nearly all of them convicts, 2 carts, 3 drays, and some pack horses. The men were heavily armed with pistols and muskets, and discipline was the watchword. The major wore a cocked hat, a uniform, and a sword, and felt himself inspired by the ardour of his military days.
It seemed that even war and victory, with all their glory, were far less alluring than the pursuit of researches such as these, the objects of which were to spread the light of civilization over a portion of the globe yet unknown.
Mitchell's first expedition did not spread much light on unknown country. His object was to check a story by a runaway convict, Clark the Barber, that a great river, the Kindor, flowed northwest across the continent. So Mitchell travelled through settled areas on the Peel River, pressed on to the Namoi, Guida and the Barwon rivers, and followed the Barwon till it became the Darling River of Captain Sturt. Mitchell's expedition only proved that there was no Kindor River and that Clark the Barber was lying his head off. Mitchell also confirmed Sturt's theory that the western rivers flowed into the Darling. But of course the last thing that Major Mitchell wanted to do was to confirm any theory held by Captain Sturt. However, Mitchell did establish one first on this expedition. 2 of his men, left with stores at Wheel Ponds near Mungandai, were killed by Aborigines. The first, though not the last, violent deaths in Australian exploration. Captain Sturt, on his first expedition, discovered the upper Darling River. On his second expedition, he followed the Murray River to the sea. And he was confident that a river he'd found flowing into the Murray from the north was the Darling River. But this was still an assumption, because nobody had followed the full course of the Darling. Major Mitchell was sent out by Governor Burke in 1835 to prove, or as Mitchell hoped to disprove, Sturt's theory that the Darling flowed into the Murray. This monument at Boree on the highway outside Orange marks the starting point of Mitchell's second expedition. From here, Mitchell trekked away towards the Darling at the head of the largest and most aggressive expedition yet seen in Australia. Mitchell once again rode like a general at the head of 24 heavily armed men. Along with 7 pack horses, 7 carts, 15 sheep and a pack of dogs, the party hauled a boat carriage, specially designed according to this sketch by Mitchell. It held 2 boats, one fitting inside the other, and both cushioned by canvas belts from the jolting of the cartwheels. Mitchell carried a pocketful of dried peas, and after every 100 paces of his horse, he transferred a pea to another pouch. 9 peas represented 1 mile. Whenever he changed direction, he counted the peas to measure the distance travelled, took compass bearings of his new direction, and started counting again. His maps were meticulous and accurate, and he has been called the best technically equipped of the early Australian explorers. But he was not the best temperamentally equipped. His whole approach made it look as if he was setting out not to discover the country, but to conquer it. Major Mitchell eventually reached the Darling at a point not far south from where Sturt had first seen it, 6 years before. Mitchell built a stockade, which he named Fort Burke for the governor, and he laid out his camp according to the plan he always followed.
The carts were drawn up in one line, with the wheels close to each other, and parallel to it stood the boat carriage, room being left between them for a line of men. We had thus at all times a secure defence against spears and boomerangs in case of any general attack. 2 light carts covered our flank, the men's tents the other. The door of my tent usually faced towards the meridian. One great convenience of having a fixed plan of encampment was that I could choose the place free from trees and establish the whole party on the ground merely by pointing to the position of my own tent and the way it was to face. And no further orders were necessary.
After all his methodical planning, Mitchell found the boats impractical, and he had to abandon the Fort Burke stockade and move overland down the Darling. In a fortnight, he reached the locality of Wilcannia, and in another fortnight, he made camp on the eastern side of the Darling, opposite the present site of Menindee. He had travelled nearly 500 kilometres down the Darling, and it seemed clear from the lie of the land that the river would continue to run southwest. Mitchell now decided to turn back without tracing the Darling to the Murray.
The identity of this river with that which had been seen to enter the Murray now admitted of little doubt, and the continuation of the survey to that point was scarcely an object worth the peril likely to attend it.
Mitchell was not asked to make speculations. His orders were to follow the Darling to wherever it might lead. But he disobeyed Governor Burke, just as he'd earlier disobeyed Governor Darling. The reason he gave for turning back from the Darling here at Menindee was the peril threatening his party from a band of hostile Aborigines who were setting the bush on fire all around him.
I never saw such unfavorable specimens of the Aborigines as these children of the smoke. They were so implacably hostile and shamelessly dishonest. Whether they were by nature implacable, or whether their inveterate hostility proceeded from some cause of disquiet or apprehension unimaginable by us, it was too probable that they might ere long force upon us the painful necessity of making them acquainted with the superiority of our arms.
The Aborigines soon learnt about the superiority of white men's arms. There was a fight at the riverbank over the possession of a kettle, and Mitchell's men opened fire. At least 2 of the Aborigines were killed, including a woman with a baby strapped to her back, and the rest were driven off. Governor Burke in Sydney didn't learn immediately about these deaths, but he was not happy about the expedition.
Major Mitchell, as you're aware, did not finish the course of the Darling on his last exploration. I'm sending him out again to finish and return to the colony through the country bordered by the left bank of the Murray and Murrumbidgee and the Snowy Range. It is, I believe, fine pastoral country. It would be highly useful to know it. The Surveyor General is a very difficult man to manage.
If anyone still needed proof that Mitchell was a difficult man to manage, Mitchell supplied that proof on his 3rd expedition. He was sent back by Governor Burke to his bush starting point, Boree, outside Orange, with very clear instructions. He was to pick up the Darling at the point he'd left it, at Menindee, and to follow it wherever it led. If, as expected, it led to the Murray, then he was to follow the Murray back up into the country which had already been explored by human hovel. But Mitchell did neither of these things. Instead, he headed first for a river that Governor Burke had never mentioned, the Lachlan. The expedition Mitchell formed at Boree Station was again the biggest and most aggressive yet seen in Australia.
Ready, sir.
It included 27 men, all heavily armed.
I organized the party and armed the men. I distributed to each a new suit of clothing consisting of grey trousers and a red woolen shirt. The latter article, when crossed by white braces, giving the men somewhat of a military appearance. This was the army with which I was to traverse unexplored regions.
Company dismissed.
Peopled, as far as we knew, by hostile tribes. I was proceeding on a service not very likely to be peaceful, for the natives here had assured me that the Miles were coming up to meet us.
Mitchell claimed he followed the Lachlan River to be sure of water supplies, but he was also hoping somehow to disprove Captain Sturt's theories. However, the Lachlan led him to the Murrumbidgee, and the Murrumbidgee led him to the Murray, discoveries already made by Sturt 6 years earlier. Mitchell now had no choice but to follow the Murray. Well, he believed that he was being followed by the same tribe of Myalls, or wild blacks, that he'd already fought with on the Darling. There's some question whether it was the same tribe, but worse was to come here on the Murray, at a place that Mitchell named Mount Dispersion. Pursued by a large body of blacks shouting war cries, he decided to stage an ambush. From this time, dispersion was to mean in Australia a massacre of Aborigines.
Our own safety and further progress evidently depended upon our attacking them forthwith. It is very difficult to come upon such enemies hovering in our rear with the lynx-eyed vigilance of savages. I succeeded, however, by sending back a party of volunteers through the scrub to take them in the flank, while I halted the rest of the party, suddenly, beyond a hill to which I knew the savages were likely to follow us. Attacked simultaneously by both parties, the whole betook themselves to the river, my men pursuing them and shooting as many as they could. Numbers were shot in swimming across the Murray, and some even after they had reached the opposite shore. In a very short time, the usual silence of the desert prevailed upon the banks of the Murray, and we pursued our journey unmolested.
Mitchell's attitudes towards the Aborigines were complex. He adopted a black girl into his own family. He praised the skill and intelligence and bushcraft of the Aborigines. He wrote many pages describing their customs. He said he was sorry that their way of life was doomed by the white man's arrival, and he could understand why they saw whites as invaders and destroyers. And yet, what could have looked more like an invading army and provoked more hostility than Mitchell's own expeditions? As for the ambush, many more blacks would have died, except that one of Mitchell's men fired too soon and revealed the trap. Obviously, he meant to teach them a lesson, and he did. He scared them away. But he left a trail of bitterness and blood. Mitchell now pushed on till he reached the Darling, not far north of the Murray. His orders were to trace the Darling from the point he'd left it, at Menindee. Mitchell, as usual, ignored his orders and decided to go downstream to the Murray.
The Murray, unlike the Darling, was a permanent river, and I thought it advisable to exhaust no more of my means in the survey of deserts.
When he arrived at the junction of the rivers, Mitchell stated that, without doubt, the river that joined the Murray here was the Darling.
Both rivers turned southwest, then westward, leaving a narrow tongue of land between. A bank of sand extended further, and on standing upon this and looking back, I recognized the view given in Captain Sturt's work and the adjacent localities described by him.
Sturt commented on this that he was sorry to reject the only praise Mitchell had ever given him, but the drawing in his book was not at all like the real thing. Even if it had helped Mitchell find out where he was, explorers were not supposed to rely on pictures in books.
Fortunately, the Surveyor General was enabled to satisfy himself. A ray of light fell upon him, and he became convinced, as I had been, of the identity of the stream with the Darling. And suddenly, turning his back upon it, left the question as much in the dark as before.
Sturt had a right to be satirical. Mitchell had accused him of being an amateur, but it was Mitchell who'd been really unprofessional and refused to obey his instructions. Once again, he disobeyed the instruction to trace the unknown section of the Darling, and that was left for Sturt himself to do 8 years later, on his last attempt to find the inland sea. Mitchell had now mounted the 3 most expensive expeditions seen in Australian exploration. They'd cost at least 12 lives, and all of them had failed in their primary objectives. Moving upstream, Mitchell found a new river, the Loddon, coming from the south to join the Murray at Swan Hill. After travelling some distance further up the Murray, he looped back south to Pyramid Hill near the Loddon and was at last rewarded by the sight of a wonderful new country.
As I stood, the first European intruder upon the sublime solitude of these verdant plains, I felt conscious of being the harbinger of mighty changes. And our steps would soon be followed by the men and by the animals for which this place seemed to have been prepared.
At last, Mitchell was what he wanted to be, a discoverer in his own right. He'd always interpreted his instructions exactly as he wished, and now he did it again, turning right away from the Murray and heading southwest towards the Southern Ocean. For once, his attitude paid off, and his path took him through magnificent country, which he called Australia Felix, or Happy Australia, and which we know today as Western Victoria. Mitchell's expedition crossed the Loddon, Avoca and Avon rivers and came to a noble range of mountains Mitchell called the Grampians, after a range in his native Scotland. Mitchell travelled due west to the Wimmera, Mount Arapilli's and Mitre Lake, and spent some time sketching the scenery before he moved on to the southwest.
Every day we passed over land which for natural beauty and fertility could scarcely be surpassed. Over streams of unfailing abundance and plains covered with the richest pasturage. The most southern of all Australia and the best.
Mitchell was exultant, and he had good cause to be. Luck had at last turned his way. He'd even found a river where he could launch the boats that he'd carried so far. And this river brought him to the Southern Ocean, near the present township of Nelson. Mitchell broke out the whiskey at this point to celebrate, and he named the river the Glenelg, according to the usual custom of flattering the British Secretary of State for the colonies. And he named the bay Discovery Bay. Mitchell was now ready to head for home, but his one disappointment was the lack of a suitable harbour, and he decided to detour east to inspect Portland Bay. Approaching Portland Bay from the distance, he saw grey rocks that looked like houses. As he got closer, he realised they were houses. Mitchell was astonished to meet the Henty brothers, already established for 2 years at Portland, and now importing sheep and cattle as fast as ships could bring them from Launceston. The Hentys were just as astonished to meet Mitchell and thought he was a bushranger, till their cook, an old Sydney man, recognised the Surveyor General. Mitchell now headed northeast along the line of Hamilton, Maryborough, Castlemaine and Benalla to the Murray at Howlong. There was one more surprise on the way home. Mitchell made a quick detour south to Mount Macedon, and from the summit he saw at the head of Port Phillip Bay a mass of white objects which might have been tents or vessels. It was in fact the infant and illegal settlement of Melbourne, already begun by John Batman. There were white settlements in Victoria before Mitchell ever crossed the Murray, but he was the first to report the existence of vast, unsettled pastures, some of the best land in Australia. And it was Mitchell's discovery of Australia Felix which put his name on the honour roll of Australian explorers. However, his position looked shaky when Governor Burke revealed the news of the killings at Mount Dispersion. An official inquiry was held by the Legislative Council here in Sydney, and Mitchell expressed no contrition at all.
I still look back upon that eventful day with a feeling of entire satisfaction and a sense of gratitude to God for his deliverance from such an impending danger, in a cause in which I consider myself a humble instrument in his hands for the common benefit of the civilized and savage portions of our race.
He seems to regard the slaughter of the natives as the result of his own measures, and returns thanks to God for being thus made an instrument of benefit to the civilized and savage portions of mankind. In this view of the case, the Council cannot concur.
There was an element of hypocrisy in the Council's rebuke to Mitchell. It might be claimed that explorers were sent out by governments to find scientific information, but they were also sent out to find land. And it was the government and the Crown which delivered the deadliest blow to Aborigines by claiming the ownership of all that land. The episode didn't really harm Mitchell's career. In fact, he became Sir Thomas Mitchell. In 1845, he made one last exploration, an attempt to open an overland track to Port Essington as part of a trade route to India and Europe. But also in the field were Dr. Hunger and Captain Thirst, as Mitchell called Leichhardt and Sturt. Leichhardt reached Port Essington first, and Mitchell turned back in central Queensland. He believed he had at last found his great northwestern river, but the river he called the Victoria was soon found to be the Barcoo, and it didn't flow northwest, but southwest into Cooper's Creek. Despite personality problems which led some associates to describe Mitchell as a fiend, and exploring with Mitchell as like travelling with the devil himself, he was a major public figure. When he died in 1855, he was given a state funeral with full military honours, and the funeral procession which left his house, Carthona, here at Darling Point, was one of the biggest ever seen in New South Wales. He had been the Surveyor General for 28 years. He had built great highways, drawn great maps, and discovered valuable new country. For most men, it would have been enough, but Mitchell wanted all the glory and more. As he himself wrote,
"Farewell to thy mountains, Australia, to the high icy peaks and snows, the tempests that round me did play there, to the heat and the hatred below. Deep, deep in thy rocks, O Australia, I carved out my surveying name. By the side of the banished but faithful, I climbed up the steep hill of fame."
the trouble was that Mitchell could not bear the sight of anyone else on that steep hill of fame. The success of rivals like Sturt and Leichhardt drove him to despair. In his last months, he wrote that he was doomed to be torn always between extremes. Mitchell had discovered Australia Felix, Australia the happy. But the one thing he never seemed to find was happiness itself.